It's a great question. I think we, for a long time, have been talking about gender diversity and racial diversity in the workplace. And I think we need to add a third element, and that is age diversity, because really for the first time in history, we have 4 generations in the workplace, all with different expectations of leadership, management, communication, incentivization, motivation, and long-term career prospects. And I think it's really vital that organizations recognize the challenge of managing a multi-generational workforce and some of the practical solutions that can be adopted in order to mitigate against those challenges. Millennials are no longer young. In fact, they are now entering their middle years. The first cohort hit their 40s in the last year. So our focus must now be on Generation Z, and they are a very different generation to millennials. They are the video generation. They don't Google something, they YouTube it. They are the fluid generation, who I think have a much more disparate and much more fluid and agile sense of their identity and indeed their brand, because they're the social media generation who have had a smartphone in their pocket since they were 14 years old and have lived their entire adolescence on social media. They are the generation that have the lowest attention span, just 8 seconds these kids have, which is quite depressing. Millennials apparently have 11-second attention span. They are also, I think, a very politicized, a much more activist generation than their millennial forebears. And we are seeing it, whether it be challenging sort of systemic racism, supporting BLM activism, or taking the lead on climate change or the Me Too movement. I think Gen Z, because of the political time at which they've come of age, the disruptive time they've come of age, they are a very politicized generation as a result. And they are taking that activism into the workplace. That's very different from their millennial forebears. And I think they're a generation who want to learn from millennials, learn from the mistakes of the generation that have gone before them. So perhaps they have a much more skeptical view of the point and price of a university education, for example. And I think they're much more fluid when it comes to understanding their careers and their learning. This is the generation, it has been estimated, will work for 17 different employers over the course of their working life and have five different careers. So they're just going to have a much more fluid and agile career over the span of their working lives. I think there's 3 areas in which Gen Z are going to disrupt the workplace. The first is, as I've already talked about, is worker activism. They're going to be bringing in those politics, those political views, those values into the workplace, and an expectation not only that their views will be heard, but ultimately listened to. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for businesses and corporations in terms of their employees as much as their customers. The second area which Gen Z are going to really disrupt the workplace is in learning culture, because I think these kids have high expectations that learning should be very high production, should be both online and face-to-face, should be very high quality. These kids grew up on TED Talks and completely bespoke. These are kids that are very much aware of their own brand, their own learning journey, their own development of their career. And I think they're going to look to your L&D departments to really see how are their learning needs being catered for. And then the final thing is worker well-being, because I think, and not just in terms of mental health, I think just a more holistic understanding of worker well-being. How the office is built around socialization, how hybrid working is about the individual's well-being, how are you looking after your workers' well-being at home in their home office, how are you looking after their physical and mental needs? Do you need and require an on-site counselor? All of these things, they're going to really broaden the scope and the conversation around worker well-being and really try to counter that culture of worker burnout. Here are my 3 tips for retaining your Gen Z talent. Number 1, don't missell the job. These kids have grown up with advertising and they're incredibly skeptical of it. So don't missell what the job entails or what your company does and is and stands for. They are quick to call out hypocrisy, corporate hypocrisy especially. And I think the relationship between the employer and employee will be a short one if they feel they have been lied to. Stay authentic, stay true to your values. Number 2, create a learning environment in which they feel they can thrive. Whether it's a graduate or a non-graduate, these kids have been born and groomed to learn, constantly be learning, and are aware that they're going to have to be very agile workers in order to cope with and navigate the 21st century work environment. So just make it a place of learning. And number 3, and this is perhaps the most important, is hire on values, not their CVs. Because in a way, you can always upgrade a CV, you can always upskill an employee, but if there is a clash of values, that cannot be rectified. Final bonus suggestion is think about introducing video CVs, because these kids think, create, and communicate in video. A paper CV will only tell you a limited piece of kind of limited knowledge about them. And connected to that, why don't you introduce video CVs as a way of getting to know and understand their values and their character and their creativity? Because I think ultimately, those are the 3 things that are going to be really important to getting the right candidates. Stereotype number 1, Generation Z are the digital generation, digital natives. And yes, that's true, but actually they're tech skeptics, I think, more than anything else. They have a very sophisticated relationship with technology in which they are highly skeptical of it, whilst at the same time being highly reliant on it. Contrast that with baby boomers, who are the fastest growing demographic on social media. Facebook is their favorite social media platform. Indeed, to the extent that it's been estimated that by 2050, the dead, profiles of the dead, will outnumber the living on Facebook. Yes, my friends, Facebook is about to become a mass graveyard. Stereotype number 2, Generation Z are the cashless generation. Well, in fact, Generation Z are the generation of all 4 generations that carry the most cash. What's interesting about Generation Z is they are true entrepreneurs and they are generating income in very different ways and at a much younger age than their forebears. Over 70% of Generation Z make their own pocket money, but they're not doing it in traditional ways. They're buying and selling goods on Depop, they're setting up events or creating content through their phones. So they're an entrepreneurial generation. Yes, they're a digital cash generation, but they're also carrying cash as well. Stereotype number 3. Millennials have spent all their money on avocado on toast and coffee when they should have been saving all that money for a house deposit. Well, to a certain extent, that is true, but there is a very good reason as to why that is true. What became expensive as millennials came of age? Housing, either renting or buying. Healthcare, depending on where you live. Tertiary education, obviously. And now childcare. Some millennials spend more of their monthly income on childcare than they do on their mortgage. What became cheap as millennials entered adulthood? Travel. Millennials love traveling. More millennials in the UK have passports than driving licenses. Technology. We know how much millennials love their smartphones. And finally, eating out. Eating out used to be really, really, really expensive, prohibitively. So you see, the economic incentives were such that what became cheap, eating out, flying around the world, and avocado on toast and coffee. And what became prohibitively expensive as they entered adulthood: housing, education, childcare costs, and health. One may argue the big ticket items in life. And where have affluent millennials gone to help fund those big ticket items? The bank of mum and dad. The real divide amongst the millennial generation is not just between those that have a degree and those don't. That is profoundly true. Nor is it between those that have a house and those that don't, although that's also true. But it's who can rely on the bank of mum and dad and who cannot. Which generation do you think is seeing the steepest rise in sexually transmitted diseases? It's baby boomers. Yes, baby boomers. Those children of the 1960s, sex, drugs, rock and roll, they are having a very nice retirement, let me tell you. And in a way, I think that really kind of demonstrates how this generation are redefining what it means to be old. It doesn't mean cruises, retirement villages, and golf courses. Baby boomers are going on great gap years, spending time in the gym, and really, I think, embracing a lot of the habits of their millennial kids and redefining what it means to be old. And one of the most significant things about baby boomers right now is they are still in the workforce. 1 in 3 baby boomers in the US is still working. Many, of course, out of need, but a lot out of desire. So I think they're really challenging and upending what retirement means and what it looks like. When marketing to Gen Z, what we really need to get our head around the fact is these kids think they're a brand and have been taught and groomed to think of themselves as brands since they were early teens. So we need to slightly disrupt that path, that traditional linear relationship being B2C dialogue, actually turn it on its head. Because when you're talking to Gen Z, you basically are talking B2B. And how do you turn them into brand ambassadors? Because every Gen Zer thinks they are an influencer within their micro communities. And then you need to think about, well, what does this generation value? Well, co-creation is one. They want to be part of the creative process. They expect to be part of the creative process, involved in the conversation from the inception of the idea. Second thing is community. And I think one of the interesting things about Gen Z is that they believe in community more than millennials, actually. They're less individualistic, but that community takes many forms and is quite fluid. So it can be, you know, a small online community built around a shared interest or shared experience. It can be obviously their local community. And I think that's been really redefined during the lockdowns across the world, where people have really become reinvested in their local area. And obviously the global community, because remember, when we're talking about Gen Z, we truly are talking about a global generation. You couldn't really talk about baby boomers as a global generation. You can with Gen Z. They have shared reference points, shared TV programs, shared culture, shared music. And so I think thinking about the global community and indeed global responsibility is really important. And then finally, customization, because gosh, these kids have such high expectations of what bespoke personalized service means. And that doesn't just mean in terms of algorithm. It means in terms of face-to-face communication and face-to-face customization and delivery of a service. And I think those 3 things of co-creation, community, and customization, whilst also thinking about Gen Zers as a brand, is key to engaging their interest.